For 6 weeks, one of the wealthiest men in America kept doing his job. He signed contracts, he approved a 9-figure acquisition, he called into a board meeting and, according to 3 separate executives, sounded exactly like himself. There was only one problem. He'd been dead the entire time. This is the story of Elias Thorne, a man so obsessed with staying hidden that almost nobody who worked for him could tell you, with total certainty, what he actually looked like anymore. And when he finally died, that same obsession created a 6-week gap where somebody else stepped into his life so completely that his own board of directors never noticed the switch. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly who was really running a multi-billion-dollar company from inside a dead man's mansion, and why almost everyone around him had a reason not to look too closely. Stay to the end, because the person wearing his name isn't the twist. It's who he was protecting that's going to get you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elias Thorne didn't build Northgate Logistics to be famous. If anything, he built it while actively trying not to be. No unscripted interview in over a decade. No confirmed public photo in nearly 15 years. Even people who'd worked for him for a decade would later tell investigators they'd only ever spoken to him by phone, through a glass partition, or through an assistant relaying messages between 2 closed doors. That secrecy is exactly what makes this story almost impossible to untangle. Once a man disappears from public view that completely, the line between still alive and hiding, and dead and being impersonated, gets a lot thinner than you'd think. Here's what we're trying to answer today. Who was really making Northgate's decisions in the weeks after Elias Thorne's actual death? Why did almost no one close to him notice anything had changed? And what did that person want badly enough to risk pretending, in front of federal regulators and his own board, to be a dead man? Only 4 people alive had reportedly seen Elias Thorne's unobscured face in the last 5 years. When investigators finally tracked down all 4, they got 4 different answers. To understand what happened in that house, you have to go back nearly 40 years, to a dockworker's son who grew up watching cargo ships come and go from a window above his father's kitchen table. Elias Thorne wasn't born secretive. People who knew him as a young man described someone almost aggressively private, even before he had anything worth hiding. He kept one notebook for himself, and a second, decoy notebook full of nothing, in case anyone ever went looking through his desk. Friends thought it was a quirk. It would turn out to be a preview. There was a second habit from those early years that people around him waved off as more of the same paranoia. Elias refused, for his entire adult life, to stay with any doctor for long. By the time he turned 50, former employees estimate he'd cycled through more than a dozen physicians. At the time, everyone assumed it was privacy. Nobody realized he might have had an actual reason to keep his own medical history from ever adding up to a full picture, even for the doctors treating him. By his late 20s, Elias had scraped together enough capital to buy out a single failing freight warehouse. Within 15 years, that warehouse had become Northgate Logistics, a shipping and freight empire with contracts across 4 continents, and Elias Thorne, technically, a billionaire. That's when the version of him the public would come to know really started to take shape. Northgate's earliest investors will tell you the reclusive founder image wasn't really a personality trait, it was a business decision. Wall Street loves a mystery almost as much as it loves a return on investment. The less Elias appeared, the more his rare, filtered public statements moved the company's stock. His silence had become one of Northgate's most valuable assets. And somewhere in that calculation, the actual human being seems to have quietly disappeared into the character he was being paid to play. Grace joined Northgate as an assistant in her mid-20s, back when Elias still occasionally ate lunch in the same room as his own staff. People who worked there at the time described the two of them as close, in a way that felt real, not strategic, inside jokes, late nights that weren't about the company at all. That relationship never became public. 18 years ago, according to 2 former employees who asked not to be named, Grace left Northgate quietly, with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement, right around the same time the company was preparing for a public offering that PR consultants insisted required an eligible, mysterious bachelor at the top of the organization chart, not a family man. A birth certificate from that same year, with no father listed at all. There's one more person you need to know about before any of this makes sense. A man most of the public has never even heard of, because officially, he's been dead for 2 decades. Simon Thorne was Elias's identical twin brother, and by every account he was the opposite of careful. Where Elias hoarded secrets like currency, Simon spent money he didn't have and made promises he couldn't keep. In his early 30s, a business venture he'd financed with the wrong people's money collapsed, and shortly after, his boat was found empty, drifting 11 miles offshore. His body was never recovered. Authorities ruled it an accidental drowning and closed the file. Only one person, it seems, was never entirely convinced Simon was gone, and it wasn't denial. It was because Elias knew exactly where his brother actually was. We're not going to tell you how yet, but by the time you understand what really happened in that house, you'll realize almost everyone in this story, Elias, Simon, Grace, spent the next 20 years being defined by the exact same thing, the parts of themselves they'd all agreed, for very different reasons, to make disappear. Every few months, always at night, always alone, a man who was supposed to be dead would let himself onto the Thorne estate through a service gate whose code had never been changed in 20 years. Estate staff had strict instructions to ignore movement on the West Wing's exterior cameras between 11 at night and 4 in the morning, logged simply as owner's private hours. Nobody questioned it. Elias Thorne paid people extremely well not to ask questions, and by this point in his life, almost everyone around him had learned that lesson thoroughly. On this particular night, Simon Thorne let himself in the same way he had a dozen times before. He wasn't visiting to talk business, and he definitely wasn't visiting to be seen. He was visiting because, whatever the world thought of the Thorne brothers, Simon still had exactly one person left who knew his real name. And after 20 years of being someone else, that mattered more to him than most people would guess. He found his brother in the study, in his reading chair, exactly where staff would later say he always sat around that hour. Elias wasn't asleep. There's no dramatic account to give you here, because by every later medical finding, there was nothing dramatic about it at all. No struggle, no sign of violence. Just a man whose heart had simply stopped, sometime in the last several hours, in the one room in the house where he'd always felt safest. For a long moment, according to what Simon would eventually tell investigators, he didn't do anything at all. He just sat across from his brother's body in a dark, silent room, in a house that legally, financially, and publicly did not know he existed. Then the phone rang. It was the estate's night manager, calling to confirm a routine detail about the following morning's schedule. A call that got made to Elias's private line, most nights around that hour, purely as protocol. Simon has said, in later testimony, that he almost let it ring through to voicemail. He didn't. "Everything's fine," he said, in a voice a night manager, who'd worked for the family for 6 years, didn't think twice about. "Handle it in the morning." That single call is, as far as investigators can determine, the last time anyone ever heard Elias Thorne's actual voice. Every phone call, meeting, and video appearance that followed for the next 6 weeks was Simon. Here's the part people find hardest to accept about what happened next. Simon didn't have a plan. Not that first night. He has maintained, consistently, that his only thought in that moment was fear. Fear of what happens to a man with his exact background the second police run his fingerprints in a dead billionaire's private study. He told himself he'd figure out how to disappear again by morning, the same way he'd disappeared once before. Morning came, and going by everything investigators reconstructed afterward, Simon simply didn't leave. He answered 2 emails using phrasing he remembered from years of watching his brother work. He declined a video call, citing the usual reasons, which every single person on that call accepted without a follow-up question, because Elias Thorne declining video calls wasn't unusual. It was practically his brand. There were near misses almost immediately, A longtime executive assistant handed him a coffee order he'd apparently placed the exact same way every single day for 6 years. Black, no sugar, extra hot. Simon, who took his coffee with cream, drank the whole cup without comment rather than risk a question he couldn't safely answer. A security guard at the front gate greeted him with a nickname only 3 people alive were supposed to know. Simon nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times, because he actually had, 20 years earlier, when it used to be his own. By the end of that first week, Simon Thorne, a man legally deceased for 2 decades, with an outstanding debt to people who do not forgive outstanding debts, was quietly running one of the largest privately held logistics companies in the country. And the more decisions he made without anyone questioning him, the harder it became to imagine walking away from any of it. There's a detail that only makes sense looking backward. In his second week wearing his brother's life, Simon reached out, unprompted, to Grace Whitfield for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Not about money, not about the company. He asked about Naomi. At the time, staff who overheard the call assumed it was simply Elias, in one of his rare, sentimental moods. Nobody thought to ask why a man who'd spent 18 years maintaining total silence about his daughter would suddenly want to know how she was doing. We'll come back to that call. It matters more than almost anything else in this story. For now, here's where things started to go wrong for Simon. Impersonating a recluse or an introvert who never leaves his house is one thing. Impersonating him during a live company crisis, with a board chairman already circling for a hostile takeover and federal auditors scheduled to walk through the front door within the month, is an entirely different problem. And 3 floors below him, in a records room nobody had opened in over a year, someone was about to notice that Elias Thorne's prescriptions had quietly stopped renewing 6 weeks earlier. The first person to notice something was wrong wasn't a detective, it was a risk analyst. Diane Okafor had spent 11 years investigating fraudulent life insurance claims, and Northgate Logistics carried one of the largest keyman policies her firm had ever underwritten. A payout in the event of Elias Thorne's death, large enough to single-handedly move the company's stock price. Policies that size get scrutinized automatically. Most of the time, that scrutiny finds nothing. This time, it found 3 things that didn't add up. First, a voice print analysis on Elias's 4 most recent recorded board calls showed a subtle but consistent shift in vocal pattern beginning roughly 6 weeks earlier. Second, a signature on a routine filing failed a muscle memory verification check the company's own security software had run for years without incident. Third, the detail Okafor would later say actually kept her up at night. Pharmacy records showed a maintenance medication Elias Thorne had refilled every month for over a decade had simply stopped being refilled, 6 weeks before his official date of death was ever reported to anyone. She brought her findings to the local department, where Detective Ray Callahan, a 22-year veteran 2 years from retirement, was already fielding a much stranger complaint. An estate housekeeper had quietly reported that she hadn't laid eyes on Mr. Thorne indoors in over a month. She'd heard him. She'd seen his silhouette through frosted glass. She had simply never been in the same room as him, which, given how the household operated, hadn't struck her as odd until Okafor's questions made her replay the previous 6 weeks in a very different light. Callahan and Okafor started comparing notes, and what they found didn't point to a missing man. It pointed to 2. Meanwhile, the public story playing out in the press looked completely different, and considerably more explosive. News broke that Preston Vance, Northgate's board chairman and Elias Thorne's oldest corporate rival, had scheduled an emergency shareholder vote for the following week. A vote that, if it passed, would strip most operational control away from the Thorne family trust entirely. Financial journalists immediately connected the timing to Elias's sudden, unexplained absence from 3 consecutive board calls, and within days, cable news had all but convicted Vance in the court of public opinion. It's easy to see why. Vance had motive, written all over 2 decades of failed takeover attempts. He had opportunity, given how much of the company's day-to-day operations ran through his office during any period of founder absence, and when reporters finally cornered him outside a shareholder meeting, his answer didn't exactly help his case. "I have absolutely no idea where Elias Thorne is," Vance said, and frankly, at this point, neither does anyone else at that company. He wasn't wrong. He also, as investigators would eventually confirm, had nothing to do with what was actually happening inside that house. Vance wanted control of Northgate badly enough to force an ugly vote, but he had no idea the man he was trying to outmaneuver in boardroom calls had already been dead for over a month, or that the person actually taking those calls wasn't the founder at all. He became, in other words, the most convincing wrong answer in the entire case. While the press chased Vance, Okafor and Callahan kept digging quietly, and the timeline they were building kept getting stranger. Household staff, interviewed separately, gave inconsistent physical descriptions of small details about Elias over the previous 6 weeks. A slight limp that came and went, a wedding ring reportedly removed years earlier suddenly reappearing, a signature that curved differently depending on which document you looked at. Individually, any one of those details is nothing. But stacked together, across a man famous for being consistent about absolutely everything else in his life, they started to look less like inconsistency and more like evidence that whoever staff had been dealing with for 6 weeks had simply never quite mastered the part. There was also, briefly, a theory investigators had to rule out entirely before they could move forward, that Grace Whitfield and her daughter Naomi might have had something to gain from staging Elias's disappearance themselves. It was a reasonable line to pursue, until Okafor discovered that Grace hadn't spoken to anyone at Northgate in over 3 years, and Naomi, 18 years old at the time, hadn't even known her biological father's identity until a single unexplained phone call reached her mother's house roughly 6 weeks earlier. The same 6-week window, every single time. Grace and Naomi were quickly cleared, but that call now needed an explanation neither Okafor nor Callahan could yet provide. By the 4th week, Callahan had enough irregularities stacked up to request a formal sit-down with Elias himself. The first time in company history a police detective had been granted a face-to-face meeting with the notoriously inaccessible founder. Callahan later described the encounter as the strangest interview of my career, and I couldn't tell you why until weeks afterward. Every question Simon answered technically correctly. He knew the company's structure, the major shareholders, even obscure details about deals going back over a decade, all absorbed from years of watching his brother's life from the outside, the way you memorize the plot of a show you're not actually allowed to appear in. But when Callahan asked one deliberately ordinary question, what year had Elias broken his wrist falling off the same dock his father used to work, Simon hesitated for nearly 4 full seconds before answering with a year that was off by exactly 1. Callahan didn't catch the significance in the room. It was a small enough error that he filed it away as nothing more than an old man's memory slipping. He'd think about that 4-second hesitation very differently once the lab results came back. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It came from paperwork. Northgate was 2 weeks from closing a 9-figure acquisition, and standard due diligence for a deal that size required the company's controlling shareholder to complete a routine executive health screening, including a DNA sample, for a corporate life insurance rider tied to the transaction. It was boilerplate. Elias Thorne, or whoever was currently answering to that name, had signed off on similar screenings a dozen times before without incident. This time, the lab results took 4 days longer than usual to come back. When Callahan and Okafor finally sat down with those results, they weren't looking at evidence of an impersonation anymore. They were looking at proof of exactly whose face had been standing in for Elias Thorne all along, and it belonged to a man the state had officially certified as dead for 2 decades. The DNA results didn't just prove an impersonation, they explained one. Simon Thorne's identity had been legally closed for 20 years. No tax filings, no medical records, no fingerprints on any database updated since the year his boat was found empty. But identical twins share enough of a genetic signature that a screening built to confirm, is this the same person as last year's sample, instead returned something the lab had almost never seen outside of a paternity dispute. A familial match close enough to be a sibling, impossible to be the same individual. There was only one Thorne brother the system had on file as still alive, which meant the DNA wasn't describing an error. It was describing 2 men who could only be one thing to each other. They found Simon in the study, the same room, staff would later note, where Elias had died 6 weeks earlier. He didn't run. According to both investigators, he looked, if anything, relieved. "You're going to ask if I killed my brother," Simon reportedly said, before either of them had finished sitting down. "I didn't. I found him already gone, and I made the second worst decision of my life, right after the first one." The confession that followed took most of the afternoon. Simon walked investigators through the boating accident 20 years earlier, a staged disappearance to escape a debt he could never have repaid safely, arranged with help from the one person who never stopped feeling responsible for him. He described the quiet, careful life Elias had built for him since then, funneled through shell accounts and false names, visited only at night, only a handful of times a year, and he described finding his brother that night, and the 4-second decision that turned into 6 weeks. Here's the detail that changes how most people see this case once they hear it. Simon didn't keep the impersonation going purely out of self-preservation. Not entirely. He knew about Preston Vance's takeover vote. He knew that if Northgate changed hands before anyone located and verified Elias's actual, updated will, whatever provisions his brother had made for people outside the official family trust, provisions Simon didn't fully understand yet, but knew existed, would almost certainly be erased in the reshuffle. So he stalled. He answered emails, he sat through the interrogation, he gambled an already borrowed identity on buying enough time for lawyers to find a document he'd never even read. News of the DNA match reached Grace Whitfield before any official statement went out. Callahan made the call himself, unwilling to let her read it first from a headline. Naomi, overhearing her mother's half of that call from the next room, would later say it was the moment she finally understood that the strange, warm phone call she'd received 6 weeks earlier hadn't come from her father at all. It had come from an uncle she never knew she had, reaching out at what might have been the only moment in 20 years he was free enough to do it. For 20 years, Simon told investigators, in the line that would later end up in every headline about this case, "I was the brother who ruined everything he touched. For 6 weeks, wearing his name, I finally did one thing right." The medical examiner's final report, released the same week, closed the last open question in the case, and it wasn't the one anyone expected. Elias Thorne hadn't been poisoned, smothered, or harmed in any way. He'd died of sudden cardiac failure, brought on by a congenital heart condition his own longtime physicians had no record of, because, investigators would learn, he'd deliberately spread his care across more than a dozen different doctors over the decades, specifically so no single one of them would ever see his complete medical picture. The same instinct that let a stranger's twin slip into his identity for 6 weeks without anyone noticing was the exact same instinct that killed him in the first place, a lifelong refusal to let anyone, including the people paid to keep him alive, see the whole truth about who he actually was. The final twist in this story wasn't hiding in a lab report. It was sitting, untouched, in a locked drawer of Elias Thorne's study the entire time investigators were searching the house for something entirely different. Inside was a will, dated just 4 months before Elias's death, replacing one that had stood unchanged for nearly 15 years. The old version left everything to the Thorne family trust, managed by a board that, not coincidentally, included Preston Vance. The new version named a primary heir the public had never once heard mentioned in connection with Elias Thorne in his entire adult life. Naomi Reyes. Attached to the will, in an envelope that had clearly been opened and resealed more than once, was a handwritten letter. Investigators, out of respect for the family, have never released its full contents. But Grace Whitfield, in the one interview she agreed to give, described it simply: "He wrote like a man who'd finally decided to stop hiding, and then ran out of time before he could do it in person." According to that letter, Elias had hired a private investigator 8 months before his death, not to surveil his daughter, but to finally understand the life he'd chosen to stay out of for 18 years. He'd apparently spent most of that final year drafting, redrafting, and shelving a phone call to Naomi he could never quite bring himself to make. The same call, it turns out, that Simon ended up making in his place, by accident, simply trying to sound like his brother during a routine week of impersonation. That means the one moment Naomi ever got to hear something resembling her father reaching out to her wasn't actually her father at all. It was a stranger she'd later learn was her uncle, unknowingly finishing a conversation the real man had spent a year being too afraid to start. Simon ultimately pleaded guilty to identity fraud, obstruction, and several related charges tied to his 6 weeks impersonating his brother. Prosecutors, given the scale of the deception, initially pushed for a lengthy sentence. Naomi, by then the controlling shareholder of Northgate Logistics, and the only person in this story with a legitimate claim to call herself a victim, asked the court for leniency. He spent 20 years hiding so he wouldn't hurt anyone else again, she said in her single public statement on the case. For 6 weeks, hiding as someone else, he actually helped somebody. Mostly, it turned out, he helped me. Simon received a reduced sentence. Preston Vance's takeover vote collapsed the moment the new will was authenticated, and he quietly sold his remaining shares within the year. Northgate Logistics stabilized under Naomi's leadership, and in her first act as the company's new public face, she did the one thing 3 generations of this story had spent decades avoiding. She gave an interview. On camera, under her own name. "My father spent a fortune making sure the world could never quite see him," she said. "I don't think I want to spend mine the same way." There's a version of this story that ends with a fraud conviction and a stock price recovering. That's the version that made the business section. But the actual ending is smaller and stranger than that. A man who spent his entire adult life being professionally, deliberately unknowable, died without ever managing to be fully known by the one person he seems to have wanted to know him most. And the only reason she ever found out he'd tried at all was that, for 6 strange weeks, somebody else had to finish being him first. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the secrecy that built Elias Thorne's fortune is the same secrecy that nearly erased his own daughter from his life entirely, was any part of that empire actually worth what it cost him to keep it invisible? So let's end where we started. For 6 weeks, a dead man's company was run by a man who was legally dead himself, and almost nobody around either of them noticed the difference, not because they weren't paying attention, but because both Thorne brothers had spent their entire lives being extremely good at not being truly seen. Here's what I keep coming back to with this one. Simon didn't set out to be a hero. He set out, in his own words, to save himself for one more night. Everything that happened afterward, including the parts that ended up protecting Naomi's entire future, grew out of a decision made in about 4 seconds, alone, in a dark room, next to his brother's body. So I want to ask you directly, if you found a family member's body and realized, in that same 4 seconds, that you could quietly disappear into their life instead of reporting it, what do you actually think you'd do? And here's the harder question, the one the comments on this video are usually split right down the middle on. Was Simon Thorne a con man who got lucky, or the only person in this entire story who actually did right by somebody else, even if he broke the law to do it? I've got my own answer. I want to hear yours first. Drop it in the comments, and if enough of you disagree with each other, I'll read the best arguments out loud in a follow-up video. If you liked this one, here's a preview of what's coming next. A man who didn't just impersonate someone for 6 weeks. He ran an entire small town under a dead stranger's name for 11 years, married, mortgaged, and buried under an identity that was never his. And the person who finally caught him wasn't a detective at all. It was the real dead man's mother, 3,000 miles away, who never stopped checking. If you want real stories where absolutely nothing is what it looks like on the surface, this channel is basically built for exactly that. Like, share, and subscribe so the next one finds you before I have to go looking for you in the comments. I'll see you in the next case.